our last day. It's going to be a long day. It's going to be great. We are so very happy to have Elaine here. We wanted to have her for such a long time, as I guess everyone does. So we are very happy to be hearing now her talk, which is on adult or humanities.
So great. So yeah, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, I think that I wanted to come more than you wanted me here. It has been a long time since I wanted to talk to you guys and to Eduardo and Ricardo. So I'm going to talk about ecumenical systems. Some of you maybe already saw some things that I'm planning for this talk. I'm going to give a tour, so I'm going to talk about a lot of things. There's one thing that I never talked about there. It could be my first time, and so let's see how it goes. Oh, by the way, this is the cloud of my DBFP entries. So as you can see, logic is very part of it, and there has some other things on there as well, of course.
Confused.
Oh, it's here somewhere actually.
Process nice or process.
You saw it, okay, yeah, it's there, I'm sure. So I'm going to skip many, basic things because I know that you know that by heart. You're a very great group. So the only thing I'm not going to skip is this one because this is something that kind of motivates more or less what my kind of interested in this kind of topics. So the first motivation for me to study this as a proof theorist is to try to answer this question of what is a proof, right? So this is a very complicated question. Of course, I don't have answers to that. I just have more questions. So, for example, when we start teaching intuitionistic logic to kids, little kids, right? The first example we put normally in the blackboard is this one. So there exists X and Y non-rational numbers such that one to the other expression. I know that you all know that, so I'm not going to waste time here explaining. So this is a proof, very basic. So you take square root of 2 to the square root of 2. You ask yourself if this is rational or not. If it is, then you're done. If it's not, you have something else to do, but it's good. So normally we say, okay, classically this is cool, but if you're intuitionistic mathematicians, we say, wait a minute, is it the case that this is rational or irrational, right? Of course, you have a way around that. So, for example, you could go to Hilbert's 7th problem, and this is only an instance of this problem. So, the 7th problem of Hilbert says that if alpha and beta are algebraic numbers, alpha not 0 or 1, and beta is not a real rational number, then one to the other is trusted. Okay, so and then I took the proof from this book, Irrational Numbers by Eden. I studied this when I did undergrad in math long time ago. So I read this proof once in my life, but of course I forgot. It has been a long time. I'm not going to put all the proof here. As you can see, I'm skipping some pieces of the proof. And then you can say, well, so now we are done, right? I mean, square root of 2 to the square root of 2 is transcendental, hence it's irrational, right? Yeah, sure, but then we have to be careful because, the last lemma is by contradiction. So you have, so this intuitionistic person is not right? As I said, I didn't go through all the proofs, so I don't know if this is really a contradiction or not, or what it means to this proof, if they accept it or not, if they have another proof. I don't know. John, I'm sure that John has the answer for that. So, what's ecumenism? So this is the second motivation for me. So, I was reading by Luis Carlos, and he was the first one who coined this word, ecumenism. And ecumenical comes from the Greek oikumene, which means the whole inhabited world. It has been taken by religion people to talk about something else. But in the end, for me at least, what it means is it's a process for the look for unicity. So where we can have different views or different thoughts or different languages or ideas or whatever, and make them coexist and peace. Okay. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is to show you more or less what really ecumenical systems are, in my point of view, what they're good for, why we should care about that, what's the real motivation, and so on. And I'm going to do that only in a very particular view. So I'm not going to talk about the work of Calero and other people trying to put together intuitionistic and classical logic via axioms. I'm not going to talk about axioms at all, but I'm going to talk about connectives. What makes a connective classical or intuitionistic? This was Pravet's main idea at the beginning, so inference of inferentialism. And in this talk, what I'm going to do is to try to answer this question also for modalities in many different ways. So there are some ways that I've been doing for almost 5 years now with WIS. So I'm going to put this only for reference or historical reference. And then the new view that we have using proof theory and semantics that is coming later. So this is the outline. So let's start. So Profit's, his main motivation was to take a look at, for example, the excluded middle. And it goes for a classical logician, for intersemistic logician does not. And his goal was to use proof theory to try to argue why something would happen, or this would happen, this would hold in classical logic and not in intersemistic logic. So I put here a sequent calculus presentation of the thing. So if you try to prove this in classical logic, you know that powers and gamma are the same thing, and then you have a easy proof. If you try to do the same in intersemistic logic, for example, restricting this to only one formula, you cannot. There are many other ways of explaining the thing. I'm not going through that. But the private solution for that was that they are not the same connectives. So we're not talking about the same connectives. And this is his quote from this paper, is that the classical logician is not asserting what the intersemistic logician denies. So the classical logician asserts that A or not A is classically valid, to which the intersemistic logician does not object. He objects to the universal validity of A or not A intersemistically, which is not asserted by the classical logician. Okay, so actually what Profit says or says is that they are talking about the same thing. They agree, they completely agree on things. So the connective is not the same, just that. Okay, so then he proposed this net reduction system. He didn't call this ecumenical system or NLA or anything. I mean, this is Luis Carlos and me and I, placing names for things. So basically, he separated the connectives into three. The first ones are the connectives that he said that they're like an agreement between classical and intersemistic logicians. They would be the negation, the conjunction, the universal quantifier, and the bottom as well, okay? And then the classical and intersemistic logician, they would have their own views of this connectives because they're different for him. So if you can, if you take a look, for example, in this rule for the existential, for the introduction of the existential quantifier here, for you to be able to introduce this, you need negation and you need follow. So this is my first criticism towards Profit's ideas. So this is the first, I have two at least. So the first one is that if you want to talk about inferentials, and if you want to talk about the meaning of connectives, you should never define a connective using other connectives, right? And I say define because Profit has this view, he had done it as well, that the introduction was actually define connectives, right? So this is not my view, so it's okay. So this is the first criticism I have. And this is translated really well in this proof. So if you want to prove this kind of first law, I'm going to talk about this later a little bit more. The only way you can do that in his system, but also in natural reduction for any natural reduction system that I know that has some sort of double negated kind of formula or rule, you have this problem because you're talking about something that has only implications and you need negation for proving that. So if you take a fragment of classical logic with only implication, you're not able to prove this formula in this fragment, okay? And I don't think that this is good as well. So now it comes the second problem that I see in his work, and this bothers me quite a lot. The atomic predicate. So there's nothing said about the atomic predicate. So in his work, in the grammar, he puts the intersemistic predicates and the classical predicates, a version of them. And in the rules, there is a rule saying that a classical predicate is provable if and only if not the intersemistic version of that is provable. And I think this is really unfortunate to have, because at the end of the day, what you have, if you have this, at the end of the day, what you have is only a kind of double negation translation. I'm going to stop a little bit on this later, I think. So, but the more, the more philosophical aspect of that, I would say, is that there are some predicates or propositions that are intrinsically intersencing, right? So, for example, if you take equality in the natural numbers, there is a finite procedure to determine if A is equal to B. You can do that in a finite number of steps. It's really easy. So this is really intersenistic in nature. You can construct of that, right? But if, on the other hand, if you go to the reals, then things are more complicated. So, for example, you can find what appartness is with these two axioms there, saying that it's never the case that A is not equal to A, and and then there's the opposite of transitivity, right? If A is not equal to B, then A is not equal to C, or B is not equal to C. Of course, there is a quantifier. And then you can define what equality is using this. Like, it's not going to be the case that A is not equal to B, right? But then you have problems because there is a finite computation to say when two real numbers are not the same. You just take one minus the other, you take modulus of this, and if you go computing this thing until you find something different from zero, right? This is finite. If they are not equal, you're going to find this at some point. But if you negate this, you don't have a finite procedure to say when they're equal. I mean, you are never going to find zero, everything like zero, right? You're never going to find something different from zero in your decimal thing. So this is not finite. So actually, this is classical in nature. So see, it's a complicated kind of thing. This is never discussed by projects, and this is important for something that I'm going to talk at the end. And it comes here actually, but then at the end I'll talk about this really quickly. Is about if you have relations. So when we talk about modology, so this is what I'm going to talk again. It's really important for you to understand what relations are. I mean, the properties that can put on relations. So for example, there is this one called connectedness that you can define in two ways at least. There is a universal quantifiers all over here. So either A is related to B or B is related to A, or you can say, okay, if it is not the case that A is equal to B, then either A is related to B or B is related to A. Okay, so classically, if you have reflexivity in the relation, they're the same thing. Because of course that this implies this. The other way around is just if you're classical and R is reflexive, you can show this, but you cannot in the intersenistic logic. So meaning that if you have as background logic, classical logic, then you're going to have the same characterization of the logic, model logic called S4.3. That'll be S4 plus connectedness. But if you're in intersenistic logic, you're going to have two different extensions of the thing. So yeah, and this is going to make a huge difference on what you are going to have at the end, or how you reason about that, as we're going to see at the end of this talk. So let's come back to the first aspect that I don't like, and the Proud's formulation, that is the system is not pure. So you depend on other connectives. So there are many ways of purifying this, right? One is using polarities. I'm not going to enter into details of that at all. So don't worry, I'm just going to pass through and say, okay, we can use this to save the day. And the other one is to add stoop, and this I'm going to talk a little bit more because I think it's important. And for what I'm going to say later. So what's to add the stoop? Instead of having one formula in the natural reduction setting, you're going to have at most one formula here and a set of formulas here. Okay, you carry them along with you. So this is called stoop. And I put here an example. So that same rule there, you can read this using stoop like this. So if you want to prove, so I read the result, and I'm so sorry about that. I already told that this is a problem that I have, but I'm going to carry this for the rest of my life. I'm too old to change that. So reading this proof button up. So if I want to prove this, it's enough for me to prove this. And this is, I just do right away the existential quantifier, but I make a copy inside the scope and I carry inside the classical context and I carry it. Okay, so I have to remember. So you know well the difference between existential quantifiers and classical intuitionistic logic is that in classical logic you can choose something to instantiate with something, then you forget about this, and then you choose something else, right? Yeah. So in intuitionistic logic you cannot do that. Once you choose to instantiate this with something, you have to carry this for your whole life to the end. Okay. So this is the system we have, Luis and I, and Luis and me, I don't know, Luis and me persona, and you can see that now you don't have negations anywhere, but when you have to have negations. And then so instead of putting negations out there, what we do is to remember the thing in the context. So this is going to be remembered up to the end of the proof. So you don't lose information. So classical logic is also all in this setting is all about not losing information anyway. And of course, the idea is this one. So if you had the system a la Pravit, what you're going to do is to discharge negate itself. In our setting, you just put this thing here. And as I said, I presented that some of this in the talk last week. So sorry if you saw this second time. But as I said, this is not, first of all, it seems like only perfumeria, seems like only I'm not doing anything, but there's a lot being done there. When you do this kind of things, you allow this to have, for example, terms. So you can type this thing. You can give a term for this thing. You can use the formulas as types correspondence. While here you cannot. It's impossible. Okay, so it's not a matter of taste. It's really a very good step. So now you can talk about Peirce's law in the system, and you see there's no negation there. No negation. So now we can stay inside the fragment. We don't need to go outside. This is something else. And it tells a lot, computationally speaking, although I know that it's not the thing. So, and more interestingly, we can do it with the other one as well. I mean, I don't need all of them to be classical. I mean, some of them can be intuitionistic. The only one who has to be classical is this one, and the other ones can be whatever. And then I have the proof of the Peirce law in ecumenical systems. Cool. So why should we do this? So the first answer is, as I said, it's a good way of talking about computation. So now we can define a term calculate for this. I'm not going to talk about this because I don't think this is the right audience for that. And I talked about this last week. Second thing is that you can actually, when I say that, this can be intuitionistic, this can be intuitionistic, this has to be classical, I'm telling you that when we prove this step is going to be constructed, this step is going to be constructed, and this step is not going to be constructed. And then when talking about proofs, I mean mathematical proofs, like the first one that I put, first slide, you can pinpoint exactly where you need to be classical and where you can be constructed. So this is good, and people are using this for proof assistance. So if they want proof assistance to communicate, some are based in intuitionistic logic, some are based in classical logic, and then they don't communicate. But now, if you have an ecumenical language, you can put everything in this ecumenical language and make them talk, which is good. Okay, so I'm not very natural reduction kind of girl. I'm more sequent calculus. But I'm going to the dark force of dark side of the force because of his dragging me there. So what we did with Valeria was exactly to transform natural reduction, Pravit's natural reduction, into sequent calculus. This was 2 years ago, so it seems like forever now. And with in a very recent work, what we did was this is not 2022, it's 2023, so maybe this year, we changed this for stool, so now we don't have the negations anymore. Okay. What can we prove in this kind of systems, just for you to have an idea? So we can prove, for example, that if I have A implies bottom, either classically or intuitionistically, they are going to be equivalent, and they are going to coincide with negation. So this is private motivation for negation, although I don't agree with the motivation, but well. The classical connectives you can always define using the neutral ones and negation, which is neutral as well. And well, this is the proof of this thing of that and the other way around. Intuitionistic connectives always imply the classical connectives. And you have some negative results. So for example, the other way around is not true. So you cannot prove, in general, you cannot prove the classical connectives imply the intuitionistic connectives. You cannot prove, of course you can prove this, but you cannot prove this as expected, and there you go. Yeah, so and what Luis loves the most is this one, that you can prove that if you have A and you have a constructive proof of B from A, then you have a constructive proof of B, of course. But if you change this constructive proof from A to B to classical proof, then you cannot do the thing anymore. And this is expected, right? I mean, I think this is a good thing to have for the reason. No problem. Finally, just to finish this, I know that I'm going too fast, but I want to get to a more interesting point that I've never talked about before. We can prove that this consequence symbol here is intuitionistic, as it should be. But if this formula here is classical, then the impairment is classical. So you're completely inside classical logic, and this justifies an ecumenical view of impairments or Proud's proposal. So it's using some more proof theory for justify some claims that Proud's did in 2015. Okay, so a very broad, quick piece of talk about polarities. So if we talk, I know that you don't like cut. I mean, you guys are great. This is transitivity, but let me talk about that. So if you take the system that Liz and I have and add this rule here, which is cut, and the cut is you're going to cut. You may have two ways of cutting things, right? I mean, you can cut with the formula and the stool, and this is fine. But you can also cut with the formula that is in the classical context with the other one, right? If you add this rule to the system, it collapses to classical logic. So we are always in this line, really, really fine line, where if we do something wrong, we collapse to classical logic. So which says, if I have this cut, then I can prove A or not A intuitionistically, and this is not good, okay? Cool. So, but this cut is needed because when you try to do cut combination in the other version, at some point you're going to arrive there. So you need this cut. So the way around this is to put polarities, right? And then I'm going to say that formulas can be positive or negative, and I'm going to give a definition of these things. So negative are going to be the classical formulas, positive are going to be all the other ones, so neutral or intuitionistic. And then we add these two rules. They are structural rules. I mean, they are here before as well, but now we only are now to relate something or to choose something bottom up to prove if the thing is intuitionistic. And anytime that you have something classical here, you can store this information. So then if you do like this, and then you define cut the right way, then you have cut elimination, you can eliminate that. So the difference is that now here, instead of letting this to be anything, you can only cut negative formulas. And the thing is that the counterexample I have here is with the positive formula. So you cannot, you don't allow this. Okay, so then now we have cut elimination. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to slow down. And I'm sorry, I mean, I'm talking quite fast because this for me is really, yes?
We distinguish the narratives and the formula.
Yeah, it's only with the connectives. You look at the connectives. So yeah, if the main connective is classical, if the formula is negative. You don't have to go inside or anything. If the main connective is neutral or intuitionistic, then it's positive. And it's really simple. So yeah, good question. And yeah, so let's talk a little bit about something that I don't know. Quoting Dave the other day, I don't know quite well or almost nothing. And if you want to ask anything about this, you ask Uri. He's going to give you talk afterwards. He's the expert in this role, or Bogdan, because Bogdan has also worked on that. So let me.
I still don't know what's a logical connector.
So let me talk a little bit about improved theoretic semantics. So the idea is to always to answer the same thing, but now let's look at something completely different, okay? As I said, I'm not a natural introduction kind of girl. I'm not a semantic kind of girl as well, but at least here I can understand something, right? So what's the meaning of a logical connective? That's a very good question. So let's take the discharge. So if I put this, A or B is valid only if it is possible to give a proof of either A or B. Yeah, so is this sentence, A or B is valid only if it is possible to give a proof of either A or B, correctly determine the meaning of the classical discharge. So what do you think? No, of course not, right? No, you're right. Okay, and if I change intuitionistic for classical for intuitionistic, but yes. Who think that the answer is yes? She thinks it's yes. You think it's well. You think it's no. Well, I do. I think that the answer is no, because to give a proof of either A or B is of A or B, you don't know. So it's not deterministic kind of choice that you have there. So you're not determining anything, right? Right. So so the way that we're going to answer this question, so there are many other ways of answering this. The way that I'm going to answer is not using model theoretic semantics that, for example, for intuitionistic logic, when we use some structures on the bottom, right? So in model theoretic semantics, the validity is based on a notion of truth. And in the case of intuitionistic logic, what you have is a notion of truth, but in words, let's say. This is one way of looking at the thing if you use grid structures. So you have truth tables. One truth table in each word that you want to have or you need to have. And then in each truth table, the same proposition can have different values, for example. And then you may relate this word or not, etc. Right? So this is the way. So you have truth, but you have some help if you use predicate. I know there are other ways of doing the thing. You have the truth table as in classical logic, but you have to level these tables all over, right? I mean, you have copies of this all. Okay. So this is the way of doing this explaining connectives and grid semantics, for example. And what Project says in his paper, and I quite agree with him, is that he agrees with Quine, so I agree with that, so I agree with Quine, that this is not the way, so this is not the way of doing the thing. Because what you're doing actually is you're going to use, what's the thing? If you want to use truth conditions to explain things, then you're going to use
The corresponding logical constants.
yeah, the corresponding logical contents of exactly what you want to explain, right? So you're not really explaining something, but you're going around in circles or something like this. Okay, cool. So the idea of proof-direct semantics is to exchange the notion of truth with that one of proof. And I'm not going to enter lots of details, so don't worry. You know, this is Wu's talk, so he's going to talk about this in more details. But on doing that, the idea is to get a better notion of nature of proofs. And for something or as an object for explaining things, for example, mathematical objects. And this finds in as a philosophical background exactly the inferentialism that I was talking a little bit in the beginning. And the proposal we have is really to use proof-direct semantics for ecumenical systems, okay, for systems where we can have classical and intuitionistic logic coexisting. It's not the same thing as Pravet's proposed, it's something completely different. So the idea is the following. So if you have a correct model, you always start from the propositional, the propositions, of course, and you're going to say that P is valid in a word W if and only if W belongs to the value set of P, right? In the case of base extensive semantics, which is one way of talking about proof-direct semantics, and this is the way I'm going to talk about today, you do more or less the same, so the figure is more or less the same. So you're going to say that P is valid with respect to a set or multiset, in the case of rules, if and only if I can prove P using this set of rules. So let me just put an example so it's easier to understand. So suppose that I have this set of rules here. P as you know as an axiomatic rule, and the other one is from P I write Q, right? So then if I assume these two rules here, I can prove Q, right? Because I have P, and from P I have Q, so then I have Q, right? So this is the idea. So instead of having words, we're going to have a set, a multi-set, or whatever of rules here that are going to support the notion of truth. This is for atoms. Okay. The thing is that then you have many choices. So there are many ways of doing the thing. So for example, absurdity can be either be atomic or non-atomic. In the case of Sandquist, so Thor was the first one who talked about this. So he's the one who defined this base extension semantics. So he defines the validity of bottom with respect to a basis S as if and only if A is valid for an S for all atomic propositions. But this is his notion of absurdity. You may have a requirement called explosion that for any system and every atom, you should have a rule that from bottom you get A, for example, this is explosion. You may have it or not. Or you may have something called consistency requirement that would be that for every S, I can never write bottom in this set. Okay? And this is what we're going to use. That's the last one. What counts as an intuitionistic proof? Well, there is a proof of A if and only if it is possible to construct A. What's a classical proof? There's a proof of A if and only if, by assuming that A implies bottom, one can prove a contradiction. And hence, since if I have a construction of A and if I have that A implies bottom, I can prove bottom. So every intuitionistic proof of A implies a classical proof. So now we are set to talk about this using, to use ecumenical view of proof systems. I'm going to say that regarding atoms, I'm going to say that A has an intuitionistic or constructive proof, if and only if I can prove A using the rules in S. And I'm going to say that A has a classical proof, if and only if, no, this is A does not prove bottom. Sorry about that. Okay, cool. So don't worry, I'm not going to enter into the details of the thing. I just want to say to you that what I put there, now it's in a nice way, is these two things here. So this is a way in the atomic field to make a difference between intuitionistic and classical probability of atoms. And here we have two kinds of validities. One is called local and the other one is global. And I'm not going to explain that to you in details. We can talk about this later if you want. I just want for us to have a general idea of the thing. So the definitions are local. You can see they are local. Here we need to pass to global here for some reason that is related to this thing, but I'm not going to really talk about this. And you see you have local and global, and then the difference between them, I mean, everything is defined locally, but the global is, the difference is that it's the difference between for all x, A implies B, and for all x, A implies for all x, B. So this is local and this is global. And as you can imagine, you that know that much better than me, in general, if you have local, you have global, right? But not in the other way around, okay? So local validity implies global validity in general, not the other way around. It does in some cases, some special cases. The first one is when you have only a formula here. So if you have a theorem here globally, then this theorem, the same formula is a theorem locally. You cannot put anything as in a context. Other things that are easy to show that, you know, intuitionistic validity implies local validity implies classical validity of intuitionistic formulas implies classical validity locally, of course, and globally as well. If you have global validity plus monotonicity, then you have local validity. So what's monotonicity? Monotonicity, well, I have a slide on that, but you have base, so you have a set of inference rules. You can always extend this base to something else, right? And what monotonicity is something like this. So if something is valid in a base S and you have this, then you have this as well, right? So this is monotonicity, okay? So if you have global validity plus this, then you have a local validity. What else can we prove? We can prove that intuitionistic formulas are monotonic, as they should. So this is also something that happens in primitive semantics. Intuitionistic formulas, the validity is monotonic. If it is valid in one word, it's valid in all the words that can be seen from that point on. But this is not the case for classical formulas, right? So if you take P, an atom, any atom, and you assume that that P is classically valid, so then you have this as definition. If you have S as the rule that from P you derive bottom, then you can prove in this basis, you can prove from P you prove bottom. And these two things together mean that without anything, P is valid classically. But if I do an extension with this basis here, then I lose a probability of classical. So this is the difference between classical and intuitionistic. Actually, it has some other things. So, for example, you can prove from AC, not AI, and this is defined as a global validity for NAS, etc. So. And at the end, what this whole thing says to us is that a classical proof of A is strictly weaker than an intuitionistic proof of not A. So it's stronger to have a intuitionistic proof of not A than to have a classical proof of A. And this is because of these two things. So you have that they coincide when you go to global validity, but when you are in local validity, they do not coincide. Okay? You have some weird stuff going on as well. So you can prove that either you have a classical proof of A, or you don't have an intuitionistic proof of A. And you can have Peirce law as well locally. But then Okay, so then you have local global validity and all this kind of stuff. What we can do is to collapse the two of them. Okay? So if we collapse the two of them, and how do we do that? I mean, collapsing local and global validity is only adding monotonicity to the thing. So if I take the global validity and add monotonicity, I have a total collapse of the base. And this is actually done here. So I put monotonicity here and the classical formulas from the beginning, from the atom on, right? Then I collapse. So now we have only one notion of validity. We call this strong validity. And then you have a ecumenical way of talking about classical and intuitionistic logics. And the interesting thing is that we can define a natural reduction system, which is going to be sound and complete with respect to the semantics. Okay, so this is the thing. So if you have local and global, I don't know how to do this. I mean, I tried hard, but maybe that I'm just too stupid, so I couldn't. And when we collapsed the two of them, then it was easy to propose a system, a natural reduction system. It's not pure, not anything. It's not private. It's different. It's a different way of viewing classical and intuitionistic. In this case, well, proofs, right? Okay. So this is the motto: classical proofs plus monotonicity equals intuitionistic proof of domination. So this is the end, more or less, of the talk. I don't know. I think I talked for a lot of time. No one interrupted me, so I kept going. So I'm not going to talk about this. Just to give you a glimpse, we can. So now forget about proof theoretic semantics, because this is the thing that I wanted to talk to you about today. So we focus on this. But if we come back to private system, we can lift the ideas to modalities. So the idea is really simple. So you transform these modalities in a standard way to first order logic. And the thing is that if you use, as a meta level, you use classical logic, then you're going to have K. If you use intuitionistic logic, you're going to have IK. If you use ecumenical logic, you're going to have AK. That will be fine, which is cool. It has one box, it has two diamonds. You can prove things. For example, you can prove that the diamond, intuitionistic diamond and box, they are not self-duals, not duals of each other. You can give a semantics of this using bi-relational structures that I'm not going to talk about. You can give axiomatic formulation of this. And you can give many proof systems for the same label. You can put 4, 5, B bar, whatever. And we can, you have to be careful. As I said, that every time you try to do something and then you can collapse, so you have to be careful. And you can, of course, take off the negation, as I said before, using stoops. So we can use stoop, and we can put polarities on the things the same way. And the thing is that up to here, this is all labeled. You can go without labels as well, but of course, if you take off the labels, look, mom, without labels, then you need a very kind of stronger structure, right? That'll be a tree structure. It's not complicated, but I don't think that it's a good idea to talk about this now. I mean, just to tell you that you can understand this thing like this drawing there, and you can put this drawing into something like this, that's nested system, it's called. And then you can do proof theory for this thing, and it works, and blah, 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 you have cut elimination, blah. Okay, so to wrap up, so I talked about many ways of talking about classical logic and intuitionistic logic in the same setting. I said that there is a lot of to be said yet about atoms. There are other approaches that we can think. So, for example, Valeria doesn't like that we have only one negation. She thinks this is outrageous, so maybe we can have two. And there are many more things to do. So, for example, to talk about constructive monologic or intermediate logics in general, algebraic ecumenical models. So this is with Ricardo. And to Ricardo, what we really have to pay attention to is the view of negation in atoms. So this, if it is a Lafravitz, that not not intuitionistic, the same as classical, I think that it's not really interesting. But if you take off this, then things are more complicated and interesting, I'd say. The typing we've done, and it's it's ongoing yet, but I think that it's not going to be difficult to finish. And I think this is everything I have to say.
Good.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the enlightening and illuminating talk. Let's definitely take a look at everything that you referenced. And I have only one little thought when you were presenting the system with stoops for ecumenical logic. I don't know if you have taken a look at the dialogical presentation. The dialogical presentations are Lorenzen.
Yeah.
And you see that.
In Catalina.
No, not the Katarina version, the Lorenzen,
Yeah.
the formal tradition of
Yeah.
theology. The difference between the classical and the intuitionistic dialogue is that in your terms, in the dialogical version of intuitionism, you forgot things. But in the classical, you remember the duties that you have to the other opponent.
Yeah.
And it was suggestive, the comparison. I don't know if you have taken a look at that, or you find it interesting or not.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. But this is first order, right? I mean,
Proposition.
yeah. Yeah, because we still, what we do bottom up is exactly to remember things, right? And to have the possibility of using this thing again at some point. Yeah, and maybe, I don't know any games for systems with stoop actually.
No, but he's talking about the structural rules, right? Because
No.
the intuitionistic game is that you have to play the most recent game state that you have seen before.
Yeah.
In the classical game, you can pick before. So
Yes.
yeah,
But this is the thing, so that you can pick something on the stoop to play.
yeah, before like you come back to something.
Yeah, it should be the same, to store something in the stoop, to store something in the classical context, and to come back in the classical game to some other point and start over with a different. Yeah. So that Greg Resto has this alternative rule or something like this, which is the same as this. And he kind of had this kind of explanation that at some point you may decide that he sees things from top to bottom. And that at some point, if you write on a B, you can forget about this B and start over with an A. The only thing is that this A has to appear somewhere below, blah, blah, blah. So there are some things in this. I think this should be the same.
Very cool.
Yes, I like very much the result to show that classical classical logic was really weaker than
Yeah, so to prove something classically is strictly weaker than proving that not that thing holds intuitionism.
in your chemical system.
Yes.
So because there's a whole discussion about what translation shows and whether two logics are one logic can be expressed in another one. So I guess my question is, can there be another ecumenical system that shows otherwise they are the same, or one of classical is powerful, or do you think that there cannot be that?
Oh, what am I to say? I don't know. But we're talking about classical and intuitionistic logics, right? So you're sticking with this too, or?
With this one, yeah. I mean, in general, but
I don't know. I really don't. So yeah, you're talking about translation. So you have one logic and have another one logic. You translate one in the other, right? In a conservative way. And if this always gives you something strictly weaker, I don't know. you can always translate something into itself, and right, and with the identity, and it's going to have the same power, right? So I think this is case by case.
Sorry, yes.
What do you do?
Thank you very much. Can I ask you if you would explain this to me a little bit more the role of the stoop?
Yes.
And how the rules are different, for example, for the foundation.
Yeah, so the stoop, what the stoop does is to, not the stoop. Okay, so what the stoop does, so if you're in natural reduction, a proof or derivation in general is labeled by formulas, right? I mean, in every single piece of place in this derivation, you have formulas, and they are the vertices of the tree, right? Okay, so yeah, and then what you have here at the end, you're going to have, if this is a proof, you're only going to have something discharged as something like that. Okay, so if you have the stoop, instead of having only formulas, you're going to carry a bunch of them, but they're separated into two places. This is going to play the same role as this thing. So you could say that this is really what's, it's a label for the tree, in the proof or derivation of this thing, okay? This, on the other hand, is something that you don't want to forget, so that you're going to need somewhere in your proof, maybe at the bottom up, okay? So this things, so what we showed is that actually, if you have some B here, you can see this as not B. Okay, let's see. So this is the thing. Okay. So this is maybe the formula, the formula that you're going to work with. Of course, this cannot be complete. If you're strict like this is not complete, because if you say, okay, I always have to work here, I'll never, maybe it will be the case that bottom up, I never will be able to transport something from here to here. So that's why we have weakening. So we have weakening. So at some point you can put it on here, and then at some point you can do a dereliction, and then you move. Let's say you have a D here, you move this D here. You have dereliction, and then now this is the formula which is, so this is the formula which is here, and we're going to work on that. So this is a way of, if you wish, this is a way of giving a normal form to proofs, saying exactly where you're going to work at the time. So this is one side of the story. The other side of the story is the following. If you have, I don't know, C implies D clustering here, right? You want to be able to remember the C, so this C you're going to discharge as always, and you want to remember this D as well. Products did this using a not D here. Okay, what we do is to add, well, so yeah, so that is to add this D. So you're going to decide when to have nothing here, you're going to put this D. So you remember this D. So when you go at some point, you may want to, focus on this and work on this and again, and there you go. This is the idea. Okay.
So would it be correct to say that this is like a way to have a controlled multiple conclusion system?
Well, this is one. So okay. So there are many people that. So Greg has this 45 pages long paper saying that no. Okay, I'm not. I don't have. I don't have strong opinions about many of the life, and I don't have a strong opinion about this as well. As I told her, so this is the way I see the thing. You're always labeling or choosing to work with something, but you may change the idea of what you want to prove at some point. So this is the thing, and then you have to keep like a memory or control of the things that you're going to use at some point. So yeah, but some people say, oh, this is only sequent calculus like hidden. I don't think so. Especially if you work with the open assumptions and other things like this, I think it's completely different kind of stuff. This is my opinion. There he goes.
I mean, yeah, I really don't know what to think about this, because in a sense, it is just a sort of very clever way of controlling the interaction between multiple sequence within a multi-succeeding sequence and single succeeding sequence. And that's really fascinating one. I want to have a bit. So your accusation that Ravitz's system is impure.
Yeah.
Now purity is very important for me, but at the same time you are using both, I suppose it's a defined negation in the presentation of the system, and falsum and application to falsum to account for negation, right? Because you could get rid of the negation,
Yes.
right? And then you have falsum. Now if you are Pravitz, falsum is going to be a vanilla propositional constant. It happens to be, a logical constant as well, but perhaps the charge of impurity can be at least mitigated. Alternatively, you go for negation alone and you embrace Tennant's story about falsum, and then, again, you have, it's still impure. You're using negations as conditionals, but a conditional is just not A or B. Basically.
I agree with
So-
you. In the propositional case, yes,
Yeah.
but if you go for starter, then no, because
Yeah.
the definition of this extension uses for, so there's no way around this.
Natalia?
Well, thank you so much. That's very fun. Just out of curiosity, have you thought about kind of harmony or inversion principle for your presentation? Like, because you might have like another sense of harmony that involves these polarities, or have you thought about that? Are they inverted? It might be that they are actually.
The polarities, you mean?
Do these rules satisfy inversion as you presented?
Oh, that's a very, very clever question. So, Luis and I, we have our differences on defining things. And the first system that I had, the invertible rules were negative and the other ones are positive. So I had exactly what you're talking about. But then Luis was picky because he wanted to have everything in the stoop, like being work in the stoop. And if you do that, then you lose this. Yeah. That is positive or intuitionistic or neutral. And although maybe some rules are invertible, and the implication of right is invertible, but then it's positive. Which is picky. But then some battles you can win and some lose. Yeah. But he has a point. I mean, if you do things this way, then you can define a Curry-Howard correspondence with a type system. So it's good for something, right?
Would you say something more about if you add cat to the system, to the connected system, it's going to collapse?
Yeah. So this is the thing. So if you have this stoop thing, right? I mean, without stoop. No, but if you have the stoop, you may have two kinds of cuts. One would be something like this. The opposite version of the. Okay, so you have something in the classical context with the left. If you do that, and if you're not careful enough, you can cut with A or not A intuitionistically. So what you're doing is to remember A and not A and then collapse.
And conceptually, exactly what is the meaning of that for the ecumenical approach?
Well, the meaning is this: is that the classical context is really the classical context, right? If you allow intuitionistic stuff to be put there, and then you collapse, then you have only classical. You lose the intuitionistic. Yeah, so it's, you could read this, there is a constructed proof of A. This is something that you may or not have constructed proof of A, right? So you're forcing this to be here. So and then forcing this to have non-constructive proof or giving the chance of this not to have constructive proof. What happens if you cut this way? So you're going to put nothing, and here you put A or not A. You're passing this from here to here. Right? And then
A lot of people told me there is a hand in the screen. I know. Yes. Alejandro. I can see. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah, perfect. It's rather a curiosity. It's just that this notion of assertability seems to me from the vantage point of constructive logics, right? So I wonder if you have checked a notion of assertability that is more connected with something weaker, probably with information, because it's like, it's assertability may well vary from environment to environment, right? So it seems to me that, for example, in classical logic, the way you read classical logic inside your environment seems to me rather constructive still. And when you assert something in classical logic, it seems that it's more related with information, probably even sense data, let's say. I know it's probably more philosophical comment, but I would like to know what you think about it.
I don't know. Alejandro, I don't have a clue. So sorry about that.
No.
But I really don't know. I don't know if I understood your question. It was too philosophical for me, maybe.
Let's say that we can interpret intuitionistic logic via Kripke semantics, right? Or Bet semantics.
Yeah.
And in turn, intuitively, we can interpret those in terms of informational states, let's say. Not that the notion of proof, right? Because when you can assert something in intuitionistic logic is that the problem is decidable, let's say. But we can have a notion of information that is weaker. For example, Bet semantics is weaker in some sense. Domet says that Bet semantics corresponds to a less strict intuitionist, for example. So it's like you need you have conditions of assertability that are more related to the notion of information and not in the sense of a really strict sense of proof, right? So you can say that we have a method to decide if I'm prime, even if it takes a long time, that thing will be decided at some point, right? Even if we don't have a proof for that right now in this very moment. But still, it's probably the question that is too vague right now. Probably I will think better about it and then send you an email or something.
Yeah, just write me something and then we can discuss that later because I don't have an answer for you. I've never heard of that.
Okay, perfect. And thanks for the talk.
Luis, yes. Questions about this. Only one. Okay. Do you think this idea of purism about the rules is valid only for classical and intuitionistic logic, or it should be valid for every logic? And what do you think is the best argument for purism?
Okay, so no, I think that unity is a general kind of notion, so it's not only for intuitionistic or classical or anything. There are many people that study this much more than I have. So, for example, Murzi, I think that it's a very good reference for this kind of things. He has many ways out of the thing. So, seeing negation as a punctuation mark and these kind of things like a wall that you cannot trespass. And then you can talk about negation from the other way. Both them was some other things like that. I'm not an expert in purity. I have this view of the thing. I only think that my only claim is that if you want to talk about inferentialism, you need certain notion of purity behind it, right? I gave one classical one, but maybe some others. Morse, for example. We have a pure system using Morse and DS.
Thank you.
All right.
We don't. We are going to have one. It's on me.
La verdad que no sé yo. Bueno, una definición estaba haciendo. Así que ya era. No sé.
We are ready. Thank you so much. The executive introduced to Soko. He's going to talk proof theoretic semantic forms with logic. Thank you so much. You have 4 minutes.
So I think the title is probably a bit too large for this 40-minute one. So there's a subtitle. I had hoped that by this point we would have a base extension semantics for the full intuitionistic logic, which is not the same as full intuitionistic logic. That's a different logic, but I mean the whole intuitionistic logic. But as we will see, the connective, the exponential is particularly difficult to really sort of nail down what it means. So yeah, so my goals for this talk are precisely to introduce the notions of base extension semantics, much like Elaine did, but a little bit more in depth about sort of the mechanics behind how it works. To introduce intuitionistic linear logic, we're going to compare sort of the base extension semantics for intuitionistic propositional logic to intuitionistic linear logic. Because it's very interesting. So the work on IPL really motivated us and sort of gave us a kind of approach for solving some large fragments of intuitionistic logic, and we're still trying to get into the whole thing. And yeah, so specifically to talk about the difficulties, but to also have fun with something new. This is a fairly new field of semantics, philosophy, logic, whatever you want to call it. I think it's really interesting. I'm not sure if I should brainwash you to think that, but I think it's really cool. So this is the root directory or the overview of today's talk. It's going to be in 5 parts. This one's very short. So let's get started. So intuitionistic atomic derivability. Now, if we think back to Elaine's talk earlier on, and I listened to you as you remember so much about base extension semantics, so I might be going over some of the same things again. I'm going to go a little bit more on the formal side. So we're going to start by talking about sort of what we consider to be basic sentences, right? So this is known, we need to define a notion of a base. And a base is formed of something called basic rules, as we will see. But we start with basic sentences, and all they are just atomic propositions from a set of atomic propositions, which is allowed to be counted. Okay, so it's a countable set of atomic propositions, but we do not allow, at least in IPL, when we consider for IPL system, to contain bottom. So our basic sentences must not contain bottom. Okay. In this presentation, Latin characters will refer to basic sentences. Capitals will be sets or multi-sets. There will be a point when we switch from one to the other. I will let you know what that happens. And Greek letters refer to formulas, with capitals referring again to sets or multi-sets thereof. Right. So what is a basic rule? It is a very badly defined thing, I think. But it's all it is just an ordered pair of a set of other pairs, which gives us something and some basic sentence. Okay, so this is a very opaque definition. And a set of these rules forms a base. Okay, And what really is this object? Well, it's this. Okay, so it is a rule as we are used to thinking about it. It is like a natural deduction, okay? But this is not a natural deduction system. This is incredibly important to realize because nowhere have I said that this is to do with the logic or anything like that. This is just a set of sentences that we put in these pairs and we make them rules and we create a set of these rules and that's what the form they take, right? So we can reason about them in a similar way to how we reason about proofs in natural deduction, but this is not a natural deduction system. What we will see later is something a bit more interesting. We also write it, or at least I write it like this for shorthand. Different authors will use different notations. So for example, Alex and Tao, which are two of my colleagues at UCL, they use a triangle there. And Tor, the progenitor of all this stuff, just uses the same arrow everywhere, which is really confusing. So we have the notion of atomic. Okay, and it is what we think it is. Now, I'm glad that Ellen didn't talk about precisely the mechanics of how the derivability notation works, because we disagree on this quite heavily.
Oh, yeah.
I really like this formulation, although it is very heavy and it's awful to prove things with. It's also very explicit about how proofs work. All right, so what we mean by a proof in this proof theoretic semantics. And it's just an inductive definition. We either have on the left-hand side a set of propositional atoms which contains the thing on the right-hand side, or we have a rule in the base which permits some either inductive sort of deduction, whatever, which then we can conclude as this statement is whole. Okay, so it's not super difficult, prima facie. And then when you actually try to prove something simple, like, oh, we can weaken the left-hand side, it's like 3 pages long if you just want to like really cry. Yeah, this is, you remember that was fun, wasn't it? Yes.
So the definition of application, does that include some form of monotonicity there, or am I reading it?
This is monotone. This is a monotone break, yes, yeah. Cool, so the other thing to note is that each of these derivations, we've coined the term atomic sequence. That's the thing to note, to point out. We use the word, right? We use the words atomic and basic interchangeably. Formally, remember, basic sentences do not contain notions of bottom. So constants like bottom, and later when we go to the linear logic stuff, 1 and 0 are not allowed to be basic. Okay, but we will use them interchangeably. That's the use of them. Yes. So this is a purely basic sentence or an atomic sequence. And each of these PIs must be discharged at the inference line. So this arrow here refers to the inference line now. Each of these sets of hypotheses must be discharged for us to continue with our derivation. And at the time when I first saw this, I was quite confused, like, why? What's the point of the discharge, right? Like, it seems a bit arbitrary, and I think it's not so arbitrary. So I'm going to quote Tor from the 2015 paper that he wrote on IPR, which he says, why, from a conceptual point of view, might one consider basic rules that allow for discharge of hypotheses? Well, the practice of assuming and discharging hypotheses is certainly an integral part of ordinary deductive reasoning, and there is no immediately obvious reason why such operations should be restricted to arguments involving logically compound sentences. Okay, what does that mean? I'm not a philosopher, so this was like, whoa, very difficult to break. And so we think, and Tor actually gives a nice example in the paper, where he says, in natural language, if I accept that Sandy is a sibling of Mary, then I'm committed to accepting anything that follows from both the hypotheses that Sandy is a brother of Mary and from the hypotheses that Sandy is a sister, right? I don't need the fact that Sandy is a brother or Sandy is a sister or Sandy is a sister, because I'm committed to accepting that from the mere fact that Sandy is a sibling of Mary. That is the role of the discharge. And if I draw this, I can give a sort of pictorial representation of this. So if we like be the basic sentence, Sandy is a sibling of Mary, B be the basic sentence, Sandy is a brother, C so on and so on, we get this figure. Anyone recognize what rule this looks like in LK, right? You know?
Okay, MK.
Yeah.
No,
NK, sorry.
MJ.
NJ. Right, so it looks like disjunction, right? Not surprising. But it's not disjunction, this is not a natural deduction rule, this is just a rule of inference based on this sentence. All it's capturing is this in the figure of the system that we're studying. And it's precisely capturing this idea that B and C are just discharged hypotheses, right? So this was quite instructive for me. I thought this was quite cool. And this is going to come back later because this notion of discharge, I think, is quite important to the study of substructurality, a la Saranegri, but we'll get to that later. Right, so we have our atomic derivability relation, or Torres calls it an atomic consequence relation in his 2005 thesis. But how do we define a base extension semantics for this? In fact, where does the extensionality come in? Nowhere have I spoken about taking supersets. Well, this is the semantics. It's actually not so bad. This is not such a bad semantics. But it's an inductive definition, or it's an inductive clauses, which takes as a base case the atomic derivability relation, right? So we reason as for the base case, the atoms. And we simply say that when we get to this point, then we start reasoning using this second concept, derivability, to be changeable functional issues with it. What's really interesting here, at least for me, is the interplay between the implication and this meta-inference, right? So Tor, he just says that this is the obvious reading of implication, right? If we can, we call this supporting when a formula is held valuable according to relative to a base, we say that this formula is supported by this base. When a formula is supported by a base like this, we simply move over the antecedent onto the left-hand side. But that has no intuitive meaning. Again, if we think about all the definitions I've given so far, there's nothing natural. It doesn't make sense to put something on the left-hand side. What does it actually mean to have a set of formulas on the left-hand side? And that's what the meta-inference thing does. So Tor could have very simply just stuck that rule and that rule together and not actually have split them out. But then he would have had a problem because disjunction also needs this meta-inference to be split out. This was Tor's sort of big thing, right? So in his 2005 thesis, he also has this rule, and he actually defines a base extension semantics precisely because he does this splitting out. He has this meta-inference as being its own thing. And he argues in that paper that, it makes sense that what we want to do is we want to take a set of rules, C, which is bigger than B, in which all of the formulas of this gamma are supported. And if I take that set, then of course, the result of this inference with support will be that holds in this larger set, because all of the formulas in here are supported. So they're turned into rules, they're turning these formulas somehow into rules in this case. But then he asks the question, which extension, which superset should I take? And the logical answer is all of them. Because it needs to hold true in absolutely every case where I can do that. And if it doesn't, then it's not a bona fide sort of extension because it doesn't hold in all cases. And this was quite interesting to read. I didn't quite realize how sort of what the interplay was when I first read it 7 months ago. Jesus. Anyway, but disjunction is where it's interesting because for IPL, it was believed for a long time, and there's a paper by Schroeder Heister and Campos Science and Thomas Baker that where they talk about, so there was a hypothesis by Kravitz and they show that fails to be complete. And Tor actually shows that with this semantics, we do get soundness and completeness for IPL, okay? But this clause is interesting, and this clause is very well behaved, but this clause looks like kind of like the elimination for disjunction, right? So this has a flavor of the elimination rule. And what's interesting is that the elimination rule for disjunction is in the form of a generalized elimination rule. Okay, and this will come back later because generalized elimination rules we believe, or some of us at least, are actually can be quite important to base extension semantics. Because it turns out that I can replace all of these rules by all of these connectives by clauses which are defined in terms of their generalized elimination rules, and we will still maintain a sound and complete semantics, which is kind of interesting. So a couple of facts: we have that this support relation is monotone, very important. Validity is defined as the sequence being supported in any base. So our notion of validity is that if a formula holds true in any base, then it is valid, or if a sequence is supported in any base, then it's valid, and thus it is equivalent to saying that the sequence is supported in the empty base. Because this is a monotone operator, so if it's valid in any base, it must be valid in the smallest base, which is the empty base, essentially. Okay, so that's the crash course on base extension semantics for IPL. It's not so bad, I think. So now we're going to move on to intuitionistic linear logic. So we've all seen sequence systems for this thing, and it's not particularly fun. I think Carlos gave on the real talk you get sequence system as well for intuitionistic linear logic, except now we don't have a set there. Okay, this is now proper intuitionistic linear logic. So there's no, we can't weaken on the antecedent. But what I want to really draw your attention to is the bottom four rules. Okay, so these four rules are the rules governing the behavior of the exponential. And they're fairly badly behaved. So these rules are non-invertible, they're kind of weird, but also the notion of all of the structural rules of regarding the exponential are on the left-hand side, not on the right-hand side. We'll discuss that a little bit more later, okay? But I bet what most of you haven't seen before is a natural deduction system for linear logic. Yes?
I think your mechanism is the modern.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, so that we can exit. Anyway, yeah, so yes.
These are multi-sets.
Yes, yes, so these gammas and deltas here are multi-sets of four. Yes, absolutely. So let's look at a natural deduction system. I'll present it in sequent calculus style. The rules are not so different, but I'm not going to present rules for the exponential yet. We'll talk about that at the end. So this is natural deduction system for the intuitionistic multiplicative additive fragment. Okay, so some people will say it's linear logic without exponentials. I say multiplicative additive because complications. Right, so these are the rules, not so different from the rules that we're used to. I've labeled these two gammas. What the intended reading of this is that this is the same gamma. These aren't two different copies of gamma. These are exactly the same multi-set gamma. So both phi and psi must be derivable from the same set gamma. That's that there. And the same thing here with plus elimination. We have that the two deltas must be the same delta. Okay. Aside from that, I think it's a fairly standard natural deduction system. Again, gammas or capital Greek letters are multi-sets.
So that would be the additive or that would be the
So these ones are the additive rules. Those are the additives, yeah, and these are the multiplicative.
Right.
Yeah. So Alex and Tao and David at UCL, they gave us semantics for the multiplicative rules only, so the multiplicative fragment. And I extended that to include the additive fragment. So we're going to talk about the base extension semantics for multiplicative additives. Okay, and there's a subtle but quite large change that has to be made to the notion of a rule, atomic rule, for this to work.
Yes, can you say again the superscripts?
The superscripts. Yeah, they're just labels. They just refer to the fact that this is the same gamma. Another way of writing this would be something along the form of this, which
That's why isn't multiplicative.
sorry, yeah.
It's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so what if you just drop the superscripts? You can be the same gamma.
But because it's just for clarity. Oh, well, it's just for clarity, it doesn't mean very much. If you drop it, it can be ambiguous as am I saying, do I copy, to have two copies of gamma, or is it the same copy of gamma being used in both variations? That's why we have the superscripts, that's all they Yeah. Okay, so that's all I want to show you. I just wanted to acclimatize you to the rules of intuitionistic multiplicative additive linear logic from a natural deduction point of view. I will notice, I will point out one more thing before we move on. Now we have that tensor elimination and bus elimination are both in the form of generalized eliminations. And what we're going to see in a moment is that the definitions of both of these things that we give them, or are sort of influenced by this fact. So they're sort of motivated by this fact. All right, so let's see. Oh no, first we're going to talk about approaching substructurality. Cool. Right, so this is my definition of a substructural atomic rule. Okay, this is a much more complicated object. We still have all of these as before. So these atomic sequences. PIs are now multi-sets of basic sentences. Okay. Each of these are premises. We have an atomic QS and R's are atomic propositions. And I call these things inside the curly brackets additive atomic boxes, or just atomic boxes in short. The name is suggestive. That's the way I control additivity. Okay, we'll see in a moment the application rule makes use of this piece of information, makes use of these curly brackets. But by themselves, these curly brackets do not very much. So there's a sort of argument as to, is this the right way to go about it? Because these rules by the curly brackets don't really seem to be giving us much information. All they seem to say is that everything inside the curly bracket is kind of living in the same domain somehow. But why? Where does that get used? Well, it gets used in the apple, precisely here. Okay, so let's look at the apple now. So ref now no longer is allowed to have a set on the left-hand side, or multi-set. Now it must be precisely that an atom is on the left, proves an atom on the right. But for app, it's a little bit different. So it's, each of these hypothesis sets, relative to the same, to a same multi-set CI, must prove each of these atoms QI. So the picture that I have in mind is usually something like this. So if we have a rule like this, for example, where we have P1, P2 like this, and then we have P3 like so. And let's say we have this in the same box, and this in its own box like this, and we have Q1, Q2, Q3, all prove R. Well, what this is saying is that there's kind of a set of resources here that is common to this, and a set of resources here that is used in this. That's kind of what's going on here in this apple. These two derivations must share the same resource set. And this is just a way of representing it. It's very notationally heavy. It's not very nice at all, I understand. I think we've gone back and forth on whether we count or write this. You just don't like that rep, so we're just going to get rid of this. And I'm like, no, this is the way to go. But yeah, so if we think back to earlier on, we had that all of the atomic sequence must be relative to a single set S, and then that S proves R. Well, now we're saying that each of these additive boxes must be relative to the same multiset, and that the multiset union of all of those boxes, of all of those multisets, must prove R. That's the difference. It is really a generalization. But this, on its own, does not explain whether substructurality comes in. Right? I've given a notion, the obvious thing. We change the multisets. How does that work? Why does that do it? Yeah. So additive boxes allow for the expression of atomic rules that are additive, so common to the. And in the original paper by Alex and Tal, they didn't have that, so they were only able to express multiplicative when they were expressing the basic sentence matrix for integers. So first thing to note is that the ref rule has changed. It disallows the existence of a set of atoms in the antecedent. What does that mean? Well, it means that I cannot terminate a deduction with a weaker set of atoms than I had initially, right? What this means is that our definition does not permit weakening now. Okay? The second thing is that I'll move from sets to multi-sets of atoms that need discharging in an automacy. This, I'm sort of quite convinced that this is the bigger thing in this whole shebang, basically. It's the arguably the obvious thing to do. There is another obvious thing, I will talk about that at the end. But this thing prevents both weakening and contraction. Because if we read Sara Negri's work in the early 2000s, especially in the book Structural Proof Theory, chapter 8, she talks about vacuous and multiple discharge hypotheses. And that's possible because those sets are sets. We can do that. The move to multi-sets prevents us from doing that because we're keeping track of the precise number of atoms, the number of resources we have in this object. We're no longer allowed to just vacuously discharge things or multiply discharge them. So this is an obstruction to contraction and weakening at the atomic level. So this system, this atomic system, really does prevent both weakening and contraction in a number of places. I have not tested, I've not seen sort of what would happen if we were to say, allow the ref rule to have a multi-set on the left, but still maintain multi-sets here to see the interplay. I'm actually quite intrigued. I want to do that. I'm not quite sure what will happen.
Because maybe it's absorbed by the other one.
Sorry?
Maybe it's absorbed by the other one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah. I don't know, but I think there's something to be done there. It's interesting. But there's a third thing as well, and it's the presence of the resource multi-set. And this keeps track of which atoms must be used in a derivation. So that resource, each of these CIs, which in IPL, they're kind of superfluous, they're not needed because really these CIs can be anything, they're just shared. It's a single CI or C across all of them in IPL. So now we're being a bit more precise, keeping track, and again, they're multi-sets, and because they're multi-sets, we keep track of the number of atoms, so they still quite allow us to get rid of things as nicely as we want to, right? This is a lot of control. We have a lot of control, perhaps maybe too much control, but that remains to be seen. Right. So this horrible thing is the base extension semantics for intuition state multiplicative additive linear. These clauses, this top one were motivated by Alex and Tao's work, and their paper I think has been accepted. Yeah, so their paper has been accepted at low, so that will be there, and they're presenting talk there. And it's an interesting semantics because if we look here, we have we have this notion of a definition motivated by a generalized elimination. We also have this thing here, this set or multi-set P. This is quite problematic. We will talk about that in a little bit. But times and plus, well, both of these definitions are very similar. In fact, this is almost exactly the definition we had earlier on, right? For disjunction. And again, it's motivated by the elimination rule. Here, times motivated by the elimination rule for the tensor. But there is this comma. This is a meta level comma, essentially. We can define the semantics without it. Initially, we did define the semantics without it, but it became a lot messier. So we thought it would be kind of what they thought it would be kind of a good idea to actually give a semantics to the comma, which is quite a logical thing. The comma really just captures multi-set union. All it expresses is the idea of multi-set union. These P's on top of the support relation, really all they do is they give us this set here, this set of atoms, which we then use in our atomic derivability, right? So we then partition P as is needed, and we go. This is again inductive as before, but as we go down, as we sort of unpack the formula, we end up saving all of the atomic resources as we go all the way down to the atomic level. We have all the atoms needed to prove everything. Now we start using ample in this form to, you know, finish our derivation to see if it is indeed a valid or invalid sequence. Okay. And of course, this is sound incomplete. So how much time do I have left?
10 minutes more.
10 minutes more. Okay. Perfect. So I added a bunch of slides, which is really interesting, and I thought it was really interesting, and I added them just in case I went too fast. So unfortunately, we won't be going through all of that. But it's about how we prove completeness. Completeness is very, very interesting, so very, very interesting in the system. Proving completeness is done essentially by simulating the rules of a natural deduction system, which is kind of cool, right? So I said earlier on that this isn't, you know, those basic rules, they look like deductions in natural deduction, but they're not natural deductions. But what we can do is we can simulate them. That's what we can simulate natural deduction. This is the power of sort of atomic derivations or this system, because it inherently is non-logical. At no point did I ever say that there is a logic, this corresponds to a logic. The atomic derivability relation is just a set of rules. But what's cool is we can use it to kind of emulate anything we want. So we form a simulation base, that's what we do. And this is the process, you know, given a valid sequence, we consider all the subformula of this sequence, we assign a unique basic sentence to each subformula. This is allowed because we have countable many atoms, you know, basic sentences, so that's totally fine. And then for all combinations, we create a base which has rules which mimic the natural deduction rules. Okay, so the atoms of these rules call quantifiable subsentences. So, for example, if we have this as a subformula, we might do this assignment, and we would add these rules to our base n, and they correspond to those rules. That's it. And these are actually what the rules look like. So this flattening map is this function which does the assignment of form of the atoms, but that's all. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that this mapping to basic sentences, here it really is atomic sentences. That's nth. Here the mapping actually does allow mapping to atomic sentences, not just basic sentences. But yeah, that has no real issues. I mean, I won't go too much in depth. Another cool thing is we can change all of the sentences to have clauses. That's meant to be 2 lines there, but we can change all of these to have definitions based on the generalized elimination rule, and we still maintain the sound and complete semantics. Okay, I've shown that out of frustration, actually, not out of choice, but why would anyone want to do that? Like, what is the point? Why would you want to go down the path of using generalized elimination rules? Because the exponential is hard. It has ruined my life for the past 3 months. I have nightmares about this object. As I said earlier on, of course, with, you know, these are the rules for natural for the exponential in sequent calculus. They're horrible rules. Okay, none of them are intuitive. None of them make sense. None of them are invertible. All of the structural aspects are on the left-hand side. All of our definitions are, you know, on the right-hand side. We're defining connectives on the right-hand side, but all of the Bang's properties are on the left. So how the hell do I do anything with this? And that's just really annoying. We have no idea. I have no idea. I've had plenty of ideas, and some of them have been nicer, and some of them have been not so nice. And I've shown that all of them end up either collapsing to just say that Bang phi is the same as phi itself, which is not good, or something much worse, which, you know, like, for example, proving that you have a complete but unsound system, which is like, why would you ever want that? But what it really highlights is that the property of Bang, or the things that we should be talking about when we talk about Bang, is not Bang itself, but the resources which prove judgment or inference of Bang. This is the thing. Bang is defined by what proves it, not it itself, which is a very weird way of thinking about it, I think. And so a lot of my efforts now have been really thinking about how to capture that idea. Yeah, so I'm just going to show you the introduction and elimination rules for Bang. that are known. It's the only known system that's good. I won't go into what good means. And in that system, all of the connectives have generalized elimination rules. That's why I've been talking about generalized elimination rules. Or in general, ta-da! Proving soundness against that is hell. Proving completeness against that is also hell. Yeah, this rule is awful. But what's cool is that this natural deduction system doesn't have weakening or contraction because that's implicit in the introduction. This introduction rule uses the double inversion or dual inversion principle, which essentially allows us to, it's the inversion principle twice. Which means that we actually don't have the formula that we were trying to introduce. We introduce and eliminate it at the same time. Which, okay, that's fine. And that Sarah noticed that we could do that because weakening and contraction are actually just kind of special instances of the introduction rule somehow. But this is not a bona fide introduction. In no way is this an introduction. This is just a necessitation. Which again gives credence to the fact that when we're talking about bang, we're not talking about bang, we're talking about something which we're talking about how bang has been proven. What is the structure that allows us to infer that? So I wanted to just give some attempts that seem too good to be true and were too good to be true. Defining the exponential in terms of all the structural rules. I thought this was a very snazzy thing. This failed miserably because this actually should be the definition of the question mark in normal linear logic, but we won't go with that. This, because that's encoding this idea. So again, based on the elimination rule, this just proved, this is just substitution. So this just showed that an inference of bang phi is the same as an inference of phi. That's not good. So I added this instruction by going on to a second base greater than the base here. That A didn't make any sense from the resource reading, because remember these L's are supposed to be read as resources, but B turned out it also just covers the left one, so it was completely useless. And this one, where I thought it would be really good if we add L, a little n there. So we say that this really means that for any number of n's, L's there. This looked really good, really promising, until it turned out that you really can't ever prove anything backwards in practice because doing so is incredibly difficult, very, very complicated. So this causes out. But so there are many other clauses which we tried. These were the best ones. And my current idea is the following. So we want to reintroduce in some sort of controlled way the ability for multiple and vacuous discharge. This is the idea. I think that the idea is that bang, everything that we do at the formula level or the sentence level, so that the sentence must also be reflected at the atomic level. Okay, so there needs to be a duality. This work would be additives because I needed additive splitting of context, so I needed to introduce an additive box essentially to allow me to do that at the atomic level. So I think now we need to do the same thing. We need something which works at the formula level, sentence level, and also at the atomic level. And I believe what needs to be done is precisely reintroduction of multiple and vacuous discharge hypotheses. Furthermore, it's not absurd to distinguish basic sentences based on their content. I think this is something that, I'm not sure who mentioned it, where he said that some sentences in linear logic are like rules and some are like resources, or I don't know what it was, but somebody said something. Where essentially like, the fact that the whiteboard is white is a fact. And if I use that in a deduction, that no longer, that's not consumed, that's a truth. That's sort of somehow, I'm using the terms loose and fast here, but that's still the case. However, if I have a biscuit and I eat a biscuit, that biscuit is gone, right? They are two different propositions, two types of different propositions. And so I call this idea the banged atoms idea, where we have essentially some atoms are marked as being persistent in some sense, and the others being consumable. So my idea would be that rules would kind of take this form. This isn't very imprecise. It's not really clear what I mean by this, even to me yet. But the idea is that this kind of system, that semicolon is not the stoop that you were talking about earlier on, but it is a kind of just a distinction. We're saying that inference is made based on some atoms which are marked and some atoms which are not marked, some consumable and some persistent resources. This idea has some philosophical backing, I suppose. And I think it might work. I think this is a lot, because this now goes back to kind of changing the mechanism of how things work. It gives us a basic kind of reflection of what I want to capture at the formula. So some comments on the semantics presented, they're all really complicated. Base extension semantics is not trivial, but it's very beautiful. Because once you get into it, the habit of seeing how, once you get into sort of seeing how it works, the mechanisms, it's sort of, at least for me, every time I talk to somebody who tells me their research, I'm like, oh, okay, something here, maybe if they're talking about some logic, I'm like, what would a base extension semantics for that logic look like? Because again, these atomic derivability relation, that base, is really general. It really allows inference of any kind. We can simulate whatever we want. So, I'm here to hopefully spread my idea through the world. And hopefully, somebody might think that that's a good idea and, take it up and give base extension semantics for even more interesting logics and substructural logics than just linear logic. So, thank you.
Comment? Morgan?
I'm just curious about the last idea because it's super interesting, but I can't for the love of the world wrap my head around what should actually need to sort of have in your baseline this distinction.
Right. So
no, go ahead. I mean, it seems to me that at the same time you need either primitive, weakening and contraction as atomic operations, which, yeah, sure, why not? But you also need some sort of so you keep multi-sets and you add weakening and contraction. But that's not. You also need some sort of distinction between the atoms. So you need your base needs to be sorted.
Yeah.
You have two sorts of variables.
Yeah.
Now, if you keep them on their own, maybe, but you can't do apartheid there. You need to let them play together. And that's going to be bang.
Yeah. So that's the idea is that bang. There's another approach to base extension semantics that I don't want to talk about. And something that I haven't mentioned is that I'm convinced that what I've shown you today is the wrong way to approach substructure.
Oh, are you? Oh, no, we're gonna fight. You're not, no, but you're not convinced.
I am.
Oh,
I just cry in my office every day.
I'm so happy.
However, I must say, I'm still invested in this idea. I still think it has merit to it, and I think it can be done, but it's absolutely not the natural thing to do. Because let's just think for a second. What's the natural thing to consider as resources here? It's base extension semantics. The whole thing is about atomic rules. Why the hell don't we consider the rules as the resources? That, in my opinion, would be the natural way to go. But people in our office, they're working on a bunch of implication logic, and this was the approach that they found. And so the logic the fragment which they found the base extension semantics for is a common fragment between linear logic and bunch of implication logic. So I simply said to myself, okay, this is a cool idea. Let's see if I can extend it more. That was it. That's my idea. But the more I'm working on it, the more less I'm convinced that this is the way to basically. But yeah, so I don't see how to do it. The definition of bang that I believe should work is that it should talk something about, it should say that the resources which prove it should be these persistent resources, essentially. Yeah. Yeah, and that now becomes a little bit problematic because bang on the right, the sequence calculus is not an invertible rule. So this is now, what does it mean to say that only bang resources are what are sufficient? But if it works, then I just hide my head under my jacket and pretend that that's not a problem and say it's all good. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes, I would. I got lost in the proof of completeness. Could you repeat the strategy?
Yeah, of course. I didn't go into the whole depth of the strategy because there's a few more steps that involved. But essentially, what we show is that given a sequence, which we encode as a judgment in our base extension semantics, that's valid, so something like this. We consider all subforms of it, okay? We assign an atom to each of those subforms. And then we build a base which is a simulation base. And the simulation base will just encode the rules of a natural reduction system, which we want to simulate. And the propositional variables they are quantified over the atoms which we assign for the subformulas of this sequence. And what we show is that this sort of simulates a derivation in the natural reduction system of that sequence, basically. That's how the completeness works in this case. It's a fairly involved proof, but it's not sort of conceptually bad. There's you can really nail it down to 5 bullet points, but it's a technical result. But it's an interesting method, I think. Does that help clear up the idea a bit?
Yeah. Basically, you're like constructing all the possible proof of the sequence, playing with the rules of the intuitionistic reality. Okay.
Yeah, that's basically.
Yeah, I hated this idea as well, but then I'm really convinced me that this is.
Yeah.
Yes, you said during the presentation that you're not a philosopher. Sorry for the philosophical question. But in a moment you were talking about the tap. Let me rephrase it. From a philosophical point of view, we are used to look at rules of natural reduction system as in the sense that Jensen suggested that introduction rules give you the definition or the meaning of the connective, and the elimination rules are just consequences of that. But given certain things that you showed, that your definition, your clauses are pretty much like the elimination rules, do you think there is something interesting from a philosophical point of view to say that maybe are the elimination rules what determines the meaning of the connectives? Can you say something about that?
Yes, I can. I've been quoted to have said that I think Jensen was wrong, that the elimination rules define. No, I think neither by themselves are sufficient to define a connective, right? I'm not a philosopher. Yeah, I believe Dominic had the right idea here, where with the notion of harmony. Now, I think that each logic, very loosely speaking, each logic has its own notion of harmony, and essentially what the connectives do is they represent various aspects of this inherent property of harmony, whatever they are, what that is. And so they play together. And I think what's happening here is that if something I've noticed in practice is that oftentimes when you're going through a proof, you go through these elimination rules, especially when they're generalized. You go through the generalized elimination rules because they give you a little bit more freedom on how to proceed in a proof search, right? If you go bottom up, elimination rules are really useful. And I think that's kind of what's being captured by the base extension semantics, is that in a proof, the elimination rules are more definitional somehow, but that's in a proof. It's not saying, generally, it's just saying maybe in this way it will be more definitional. And if we look at the clause that I gave for the, all the way back to IPL, the clause that I gave for the conjunction, this is the introduction rule, but also elimination, because it's an inverted, right? So this is where that's a nice thing. And that symmetry is not shared, essentially. But yeah, so I think that it's more about the nature of proofs and the fact that in certain connectives, I'd say that certain rules are more useful than certain other rules, and that's perhaps what, very loosely speaking, what's being captured here. Yeah. Elaine?
Oh,
no.
I love your presentation. The first thing that I love it about is that you didn't use the Vixen and Fox example. I'm so tired of that.
Yeah,
please move on with this, okay? The second thing is that is an observation about the same. So remember this kind of discussion that we had? So if you have from a basis, you can derive A. Then from the same basis, you can derive A tensor A, or A tensor A, tensor A, tensor as many times as you want. And I think this is doesn't capture really the spirit of being substructural in this sense, right? So just to add to your discussion, I mean, this.
Yes.
And if you use basis as resources, then you don't have this kind of things happening anymore, right? Yeah, but this is really interesting. I mean, to exactly know what are the resources, right? The resources should be, we're talking about proofs, right? So, and the other thing that Bogdan said, so weakening contraction, you cannot restrict to atoms in linear logic. You know that. So it's going to be. I agree with him.
But it's not restricting weakening and contraction to atoms. We're actually restricting weakening and contraction to derivations of a certain type. That's what we're restricting weakening and contraction to.
But I think it may be messy. I mean,
it will be messy.
Yeah.
I'm fully prepared. Yeah, but I think that if we go down this path, that this is going to be the case. The other potential idea, which I tried, that this was a clause that I had the idea of as well, but I didn't put it down, was something of this form, where we say that phi, if and only if, for all C bigger than B, if for all L in L, so for all the atoms in this multi-set, we have that it is supported with the empty resource, then the sub-formula itself is supported by the empty resource. So this is an idea that I had, this is an idea that Victor also had as well, but in his system. And I showed that this idea doesn't work in this system because it's not sound. If we use this clause, this system is not sound. However, this is sound and complete with respect to just the two connected, with just the introduction and elimination rules of the exponential, which is cool. But when it's for the whole system, it's not sound.
Thanks for the nice presentation. So I have a question regarding the slowness and completeness theorem. I didn't see the B and the P, the lower B, the base, and the P. Is because it starts with M or something like this?
Yeah, so something I probably said very quickly is that we define validity as being in the empty base with the empty resource. So validity is defined like so. So this is an abusive notation for,
right, so they start with empty and then they coincide. And also when I see this kind of rules like disjunction, but they're also in the linear logic semantics. So you really need to consider all these superset of bases, or there is a way of symbolically saying that I have to consider this kind of and this is enough. I mean, it's enough for looking at this subset of this subset of the superset of the basis for finishing the derivation of the
So you do have to. It is the case that you have to you say something about absolutely every possible extension.
This is where you get monotonicity, right?
Yeah, so that's the thing, just to sort of really emphasize that support relation is, this is where the monotonicity comes in correctly.
Any final question or comment?
One. Can you say a bit more about like the relationship between when you have like the reflexivity and the other rules that maybe they were connected when you put the reflexivity restricted to atoms and for the structural.
I think it's a strict versus the projective version, the one with more formula on the antecedent, the version of the weakened version.
This one.
This one?
Yes.
This one? Or this one?
The relationship between the first two ones.
The first two.
Yeah, you said that maybe the reflexivity was the former reflexivity was absorbed by the second one.
Yeah.
So say a little bit more about that because I thought I understood, but then
anything I say would just be on the spot. These are my observations that I've made. And these are things that I want to work on next. Basically, it's really sort of trying to, these are my 3 observations where I see that substructurality in the sense of linear logic has been introduced. So this sort of Dawson style of substructurality or Fujikara style of substructurality has been introduced into the atomic system. I don't know is the answer. I really don't know. I believe, I just have the belief that if we get rid of this rule, we'll change it back to the original form. So we allow for a multi-set on the left-hand side, but we still maintain this, we would still have substructurality, but whether that will suffice for to give us a basic section semantics for intuitionistic linear logic, I don't know. But I do think that getting rid of this, maybe it will be something like affine linear logic or intuition.
Okay, you can avoid weakening.
Yeah.
Only words.
Oh yeah. Exactly.
Okay, then I understood.
Well, thank you. Again, we don't have break. Ready? I promise we are going to have a break. It's not my fault.
Vale la pena.
Are you ready?
I am ready. Yeah.
Okay, Luis, a big pleasure having you here. Luis, in this opportunity, is going to talk about a plea for real style relevance. Thank you. You have 4 minutes.
Yeah.
If you want,
I will need half an hour. So thank you. It has been a long time since the last time we saw each other. Yes. This is again work in progress, joined with Fernando Canaporte. But you shouldn't blame him for any of my faults. That's all my responsibility. And yes, I will give a plea for relevance, but I have changed the title slightly in order to make clear that I'm thinking in a very special project in relevance, which is Stephen Reed's view on relevance. So let's see what happens. The target of all my observations and sayings in this talk will be these ideas by Alison Duncan Kerr in a paper which some years ago, and the title of her paper is A Plea for KR, which is a funny logic. I will say a bit more about this logic in a minute. In a minute, but what you should know about her ideas is her main claim about this logic. She says that this logic is better than classical logic, and it is also better than any relevance logic, and in particular, it is better than R. Better in what sense? That's not clear in the paper, but apparently she thinks that the discussion is about validity, logical validity ordinary reasoning. So I will assume that we are evaluating logics according to how well they perform in modeling what is the validity in ordinary reasoning. So the claim is that such strange logic is better than classical logic and any relevance logic in particular are. And as a person who likes relevance logics too much, but not R, I think R is just too strong. There are many relevances there. I was really shocked by her claim. What is she thinking about this? What are the reasons to claim that? And her strategy is very interesting, I would say, because she wants to distinguish between sorts of paradoxes of implication. And she says, well, look, relevance logicians have said many things about paradoxes of implication, and you have some of them here in the whiteboard. And yes, for the standard relevant logicians, all they belong to the same bag, right? They are all invalid because they are paradoxes of implication. Yeah, I need one more. Sorry. And then she says, no. This is just an appearance. It's not right. We can distinguish between genuine paradoxes of implication and non-genuine paradoxes of implication. And what's the strategy? Before the strategy, she says, just one example, this that you might know, and in the relevant circles, this is known as the possible paradox, that the truth of the consequent of some conditional is enough for the truth of the conditional. And she thinks this is a genuine paradox of implication, but others are not. For example, this disjunctive syllogism. And she says, well, if we have a means to distinguish between these two things in order to avoid the real ones, like positive paradox, and keep something like the disjunctive syllogism, which seems like a good way of reasoning, and we will be happy, but it will not be one of the standard relevance logics. And in fact, there is one logic that can do that, and this is KR. And so, sketch of the argument, or rather, sketch of the conclusion is this. This logic is better than classical logic because this logic, KR, invalidates actually all the genuine paradoxes of the implication. But at the same time, it is better than R and all the other relevant logics because it can keep disjunctive syllogism and all the other paradoxes that are not genuine but only apparent paradoxes. Yes, I can give you a spoiler. According to her, things like positive paradox and negative paradox, and also this guy, are genuine paradoxes of implication. But implication principles with classically impossible antecedents or classically necessary consequence are not genuine paradoxes of implication, according to her. So that's the distinction that she wants to draw, right? And in fact, I don't know if you are familiar enough with relevance logic and especially R, but the thing is that if you have some axiomatic basis for R, and you plug in this, which is an arrow form of explosions, then you get this logic. So that's pretty simple. In that sense, you get a logic which is strictly more powerful than R. So it lives around here. But it is not like other super relevance logic, like, for example, R mingle classical logic lives both. So it is a super relevance logic, but of a very special sort, which includes that from classical impossibilities, and you can obtain apparently some things. Okay. So I think that's all what you need to know about this logic. So okay, what's the strategy? She proceeds in a very clever way, I'd say, because she thinks that the main case for relevance logics comes from normativity discussions, right? She reads the text and look at examples and says, okay, this say that some patterns of reasoning are not valid because they don't model the way in which we reason. For example, if some agent on the presence of a contradiction, and apparently that agent doesn't conclude everything, right? And for her, all the examples for relevance logic are of that sort, involving normativity issues, right? We don't reason in that way, therefore the logic is not classical, should be something else. But we know from many discussions in the normativity of logic that that step from how we actually reason in apparently valid ways to the rightness or correctness of logic it's very problematic. It's not as easy as one would expect. But she says, okay, we don't know, we don't need a very strict connection between the normativity claims and the rightness of logic. We only need bridge principles like those studied by McFarlane and Frestal and other people as necessary conditions for validity. And that would be enough for her. And in fact, she doesn't use any of the familiar bridge principles from the McFarlane paper or from Steinberger's paper. She uses this bridge principle proposed by Frestal. You have the bridge principle here. If this argument with these premises and these conclusions is valid, then it ought to be that knows the agent believes the premises and the agent disbelieves the conclusion. And this is a very complicated way of saying something like this. And this is her reformulation of Frestal's principle using the notion of mistake. So another form of the bridge principle for her is this. If this argument is logically valid, then it is a mistake for the agent to believe the premises and disbelieve the C. And this is more standard English, at least for me. I can understand this. The first one sounds too complicated in my mind. But in the course of her argumentation, she uses another principle that I think she thinks is equivalent to the former. I'm not sure that they are equivalent, but she uses it. And it is Restall's principle using the notion of a mistake, but in a contraposed way, right? So if it is not a mistake for the agent to believe the premises and disbelieve the conclusion, then the argument is not valid. It's contraposed version of this. But she also uses another bridge principle to evaluate some of these paradoxes of implication, which involves also the notion of being mistaken, but this time involving explicitly the terminology about genuine paradoxes. And the principle is this: if it is a mistake for the agent to believe the premises and disbelieve the conclusion, then the argument is not a genuine paradox of implication. So I want to provide here in this slide a full picture of the bridge principles that she's using in the paper. So that's mainly for my clarity. Okay, let's see how she actually evaluates the paradoxes of implication using those bridge principles. And as I have said, she uses the contraposed version of the principle using the notion of being mistaken. So we go. This is the principle, and at least for me, it is good to have some symbols to keep things under control. It's very good in evaluating arguments just in plain ordinary language, so I need some symbols, and this will be important for my reconstruction of their arguments. So I tried to do this rather straightforward. I wanted to express that if it is not a mistake, the agent believes the piece and not believe the scene, then the argument is not valid. So I try to keep things really simple here. So, okay, let's evaluate something like negative paradox, which expresses the idea that the falsity of the antecedent of an implication is enough for the truth of an implication, which is terrible for relevance logicians, because how the falsity of the antecedent can guarantee the truth of the whole thing. It's weird to them. So, yes, she wants to conclude that this is a genuine paradox. So I will be using this predicate of being a paradox. This should be the conclusion of her argument in this case. But for this, she needs some extra principles, at least in the way I am reconstructing her views. She needs the detachment for this arrow, connecting the notion of not being mistaken and the invalidity of things. She needs the detachment. And she also needs the deduction property or the deduction theorem for that very arrow. And yes, she's very clear that she will be assuming these two things. For example, detachment for this arrow and the deduction property. She's very clear about that. She says, I assume these things. But she's not that clear about this other principle that says that if some argument is not valid according to the relevance logic are. And that very argument fails the test for validity using this bridge principle, then the argument is a genuine paradox. I think this assumption is crucial in her argument. So yes, with this bridge principle and these assumptions, it is rather easy to get the conclusion. Yes, because by hypothesis, you suppose that it is not a mistake for an agent to believe in the falsity of some phi and not believe this implication. And I don't remember the example she gives. For example, if it's not a mistake to believe that the grass is not red, and not believe that the redness of the grass implies something, whatever. So it is not a mistake to be in those two mental states. But then you can conclude that this argument is not valid from this premise and the bridge principle, and by the deduction property, you can move the premise to the other side and the antecedent of some implication, and then by the definition of being a paradox, you get that this argument is actually a genuine paradox of implication. So this is an example of how she reasons from the bridge principle to the paradoxicality of an argument. I think that's pretty neat and nice because this result is shared with the mainstream relevance logician. Now, let's look at another example. But this time we are not using the contraposed version of the bridge principle, but rather the bridge principle using the notion of being mistaken and with the explicit vocabulary on not being a genuine paradox. And I formalize this in a very similar way as the previous one. I just wanted to stress that if an agent is mistaken in believing the premises and not believing the conclusion, then I think there's a mistake here. The validity of the argument, not being valid, the validity of the argument is not a genuine paradox of implication. So, yes, and using this version of the bridge principle, Alison Duncan-Kerr evaluates what she calls material ex contradictione, which is this explosion in arrow forms, I would say. And then she concludes that this is not a genuine paradox of implication. She needs, as in the previous case, detachment for the arrow and also the deduction property, but this time she needs a rather different principle, which I call in a colorful way the monotonicity of being mistaken, right? Because if an agent is mistaken in believing phi, then it is also mistaken in believing phi and being in some other mental state regarding any other proposition whatsoever. So in that way, she can obtain actually the conclusion because according to her, it is always a mistake to believe a contradiction. In a footnote, she says, we don't care about people like Graham Priest and other atheists because they are terribly wrong. So it is a mistake to believe in contradictions. And by the monotonicity of being mistaken, you obtain two. And then with using this rich principle and detachment, you obtain the conclusion, right? It is not, this argument, the validity of this is not a genuine paradox of implication. Yes, this is not standard for most relevant conditions, right? Because they count explosion in narrow form as a paradox of implication. It actually fails the basic test for not being a paradox of relevance, which is the variable sharing test. You don't have any variable shared between antecedent and consequent. So the standard relevance logician cannot accept this. So I think that standard relevance logicians should say something about this argument. Yes, I don't know if I count as a standard relevance logician, probably not, but still I am not satisfied with this argument, and you know why. You are very clever, so you know, now you know what is the yielding principle here. My main concern is that this result, it is a mistake to believe a contradiction, implying the non-paradoxicality of this is just too close to negative paradox. Why? It is not obvious from the formalization, but let me show you why I think this is just a metalinguistic version of negative paradox. You have here the symbol for being mistaken, which in a sense you can see as some form of negation. It indicates something bad, like false keeping, mistaken from anything in that vicinity. So you can think of this as a negation. And yes, you have here the not being a genuine paradox of implication, which in a sense is just too positive. It expresses that something is not bad, right? And then, look, you say something negative about the contradiction, but then you say something positive about the contradiction, implying anything else. So yes, that's why I think it's really too close to the negative paradox. You have the negation of the contradiction here, but then the contradiction is implying any formula whatsoever. You don't look convincing. Maybe I should say a bit more about this, but I will not. I will change my strategy here instead of trying to convince you that look, there is negativity here and positivity here, and therefore negative paradox. This is not working, so consider instead the following, which is pretty well known. It is sometimes used as an argument against the transitivity of implication, and yeah, maybe nothing. Yeah, ignore anything here because what I say here is not. So So the argument goes as follows. Suppose that you have the monotonicity of falsity. But also suppose that implication is connected to the falsity of an implication as the classical logician wanted, right? If it is false, that the antecedent holds and the consequence is false, then you have a valid implication. But then, by the transitivity of implication, you have the positive paradox, right? As I have said, this is sometimes used as an argument against the transitivity of implication. No, I think as many relevant logicians believe as well, that something different is happening here. It's not the fault of the transitivity of implication, but it is rather than that these two principles, these two premises cannot hold together. Right? And here is where Stephen Reed enters the scene, because yes, consider an equivalent argument for the same conclusion, but now using disjunction instead of conjunction, right? You have one by addition, right? And then you might think, okay, let's connect implication and disjunction in the classical way. And then by the transitivity of implication, you get negative paradox. But we know that 1 and 2 using the conjunction, the disjunction cannot be jointly true unless you are a classical logician. They don't want to be classical logicians. Yes. Stephen Reed says, well, this argument looks good. Looks good for the classical logician and also represents a problem for the relevant logicians, but it is because these two principles actually hold, but they hold for different connectives. Step 1 holds for the so-called extensional disjunction, which allows you to introduce any formula whatsoever. It doesn't matter. But the step 2 doesn't hold for extensional disjunction, but rather for intensional disjunction. And the reason is that yes, if you cannot have the same connective in both principles, why is that? Suppose that you wanted to have, as in here, an extensional disjunction as well. Then it is well known for relevant logicians that this principle fails because if addition is valid for that conjunction, it allows you to introduce in the consequent some formula that has nothing to do with the phi. Right? It can be about something different. And that is fine for the extensional disjunction. But then that is not the kind of disjunction that can be rightly associated to an implication, because implication, according to the relevant logician, requires a tighter connection. It's not merely that you have the true values there, then the implication appears to be valid just because of the true values. Something else is needed. And that's the job of the intentional disjunction, is guarantees that there is the required connection between the two disjunctions. If extensional disjunction doesn't care about the right connection for implication, but intentional disruption does. So, yes, as Stephen Reed says, there is an ambiguity there. And the same happens in this argument, right? The monotonicity of falsity holds for extensional disjunction. That's true. But if you want to connect a conjunction, connect in the appropriate relevance way, the conjunction with a true implication, then this conjunction cannot be extensional one. It should be the intentional conjunction. So there is a similar ambiguity there in this side as well. So yes, I mean, yeah, perfect. So let's go back to Alice and Duncan Kerr's argument. So she concludes that this thing, the explosion in arrow form, is not a genuine paradox, which goes against one of the core ideas of mainstream relevance logicians. So their mainstream relevance logicians should say something about what is wrong with this argument. And I think that a relevance logician adopting study grid diagnosis can say something like this. Look, in moving from 1 to 2, it is fine if you use an extensional conjunction. But then, because, but then you want to connect that conjunction with the validity of something. And if you want to do that, connect a conjunction with the validity of an implication, then that conjunction cannot be the extensional. It should be the intentional one. So there is an ambiguity there as well. So this argument is not sound for relevance. There is a slight change of meaning between in the meaning of the conjunction and in moving from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3. So there is hope for the relevance logician. Yes, in the end, I think this is the problematic principle. Now, in this two-way move from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3, there are two conjunctions involved. Yes, so there is at least one way for the relevance logician to resist Alice and Duncan Kerr's argument for going to logics stronger than narrow. But remember that she also advocates disjunctive syllogism. The thing is now, well, disjunctive syllogism is something really intuitive. It should be in our right logic. You have the quotation there. I argue that there are plenty of considerations in favor of disjunctive syllogism. She doesn't give that many, but let's spend that. And no good reason to reject it. As such, the disjunctive syllogism should be a rule of the correct logic or logics. And because she thinks of the relevance logic discussion in this very strange way. She's afraid of the normativity issue and how people actually reason validly. And according to her, DS is guilty just by association. It is just because relevance logicians want to block the move from the contradiction to the arbitrary conclusion that they blame disjunctive syllogism. And according to her, there are no any other argument against disjunctive syllogism. But I think that is not the case if you hold very simple semantics as the four-valued semantics. FD. You can see that disjunctive syllogism fails to be truth preserved. And you can give that as an independent reason to reject generic theology and not rely on blocking ex contradiction or something like that. There are independent reasons to attack this rule. But I am too tired now. Let's disjunctive syllogism now. No questions, thank you.
Yeah.
It's not easy to have like always together the failure of expel someone. See that it's maybe one can argue that the syllogism and go expel some and still be what do you think about it?
Do you have a particular logic in mind in which that happens?
Mine. One, I gave a logic where you can have like all syllogism, but not having but I mean, so it is possible. Would you anyway argue against the syllogism, or it's only because
No. I would say that. I would say something very similar as what Stephen Pitt says. Disjunctive syllogism is fine if you have something like this. This is perfectly fine. But the price paid for this is not having addition. It's fine by me. But just having PS for this disjunction is fine, like I just read the explanation.
I think if one has to choose, it's great to drop addition.
Yes. We are mistakes. Yeah.
Yes, so I was wondering what definition of disbelief you are using, because I mean intuitively the notion of disbelief for me would be like if I disbelieve P, I believe not P. It seems contrary to just not believing P. I basically don't have an opinion. But then you're translating disbelieving using not believe P.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I was just wondering whether if you were putting just the negation inside the scope of the belief operator, things would just change.
Yes, that would change a lot. Then I would say that I would mischaracterize Alison Dunker's argument, because it is clear from text, I think, that what she's thinking about is that you merely don't have the belief in your box, right? That fails to be there, rather than having a special belief that expresses the disbelief in some other thing. So that's why I'm choosing this, to express that this thing is not in the belief box.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for the talk. I just was thinking about a different way to resist this. It may be just be dealing with either discussion of the notion of being mistaken, so probably being wrong or being irrational or doing what is contrary to duty or something like that.
Yeah.
And regarding contradictions, right? So basically one will say, no, I do not grant you your first premise, right? Sometimes it is permissible, right, actually necessary, rational to believe a contradiction or something like that. Was wondering what you think about that. Does it make sense to you?
Yes. It makes sense to me, but I didn't want to try that strategy because I cannot control myself. And then I would end up saying things like, yeah, the only true things are the contradictions, so this is bad. Okay, let's not trust that. Yeah, because of that, I just wanted to grant as much as possible to my stakeholder and then proceed this way. Thank you. But I am a friend. Lucas?
Yeah, thanks. That was very interesting. I'm not quite seeing how exactly to characterize the mistake when you identify it as the step from 2 to 3. So because it's true that the other slide you have the negation, and from the negation of a conjunction you go to a conditional, and that's shouldn't be valid under the interpretation of conjunction as an extension of connective. But I mean, it's not exactly negation what's operating here. It is it is a mistake to operator or something like that. And so I guess that if you want to say that the fallacy is in the transition from 2 to 3, what you're actually rejecting is the principle that she's accepting. Or you're actually saying that principle contains an intentional conjunction there. When you say if it is a mistake for A to believe B and, but that and is intentional, is that what you're doing when you say that or is it something else?
I think it's something like that because yes, you're right. Of course, for the purposes of the talk, this was too quick, but it's also too quick in the draft. But yes, yes. Okay, see here, right? Yes. I lean towards rejecting this principle, or rather being careful with this principle, because it is trying to connect a conjunction with this force type. And yes, as in here, one should be careful in connecting the conjunctions with implication terms types or whatever. So yes, I would say you should be careful. Maybe if I can say something stronger, yes, this is if you want to have this principle, then you are not allowed to move from 1 to 2. Yes.
From 2 to 3, you mean?
No, from 2 to 3, because it's just the principle, right? Moving from 2 to 3 is just the principle. If you want to have that, you cannot move 1 to 2.
Maybe the other.
Yes.
I mean, the other alternative seems, I don't know, more plausible in the sense that it would be harder to read it as an intentional conjunction without misrepresenting what she's trying to say. That's just my view. Now, to contest the second step, I find more intuitive and more in line or friendly to what she's doing. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, if I may add something. Yeah, there are several lines to resist the conclusions, because from the fact that she is admitting all the principles in which you have classical impossibilities in the antecedent and classical necessities in the consequent, or classical necessities on the consequent, it's just a divisible, a good sign that classical logic is operating in a very special way in her implementation, and the task is to identify that bit of classicality behind the reasoning, which the relevance logician shouldn't accept.
Very good.
It's just a clarification was, how does the KR,
Yes.
the relevant NR treat the version of material explosion, but with a conjunction and negating the contradiction? It's not the case that phi and not phi and psi. Are they invalid in both?
No, it is invalid in R, but it is valid in KR.
It's valid in KR?
Yes.
Okay, so then so she has a worse problem now, because she should treat them as she should treat that sentence the same way as she treated material explosion. Huh? Aren't the two sentences equivalent in her view?
Do you mean the arrow form and the verb style?
No, I mean that sentence and
Yes, this one.
the one that negates the contradiction in conjunction with psi.
Yes, shouldn't they are equivalent, and I think that yes, that equivalence is equivalent here in KR.
So it's invalid in both. Valid in both. Both are valid.
Yes, both are valid in KR.
And in R?
In R, no, they are not equivalent.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
And they are both valid.
And why? Because so the step from 1 to 2
Yes.
Should not be problematic using the extensional conjunction for an R logician, or
No, it shouldn't be problematic with the extensional conjunction. Right.
You can't infer from that
yes, this is pretty standard in R. Yes, that's why they blame this principle when trying to avoid the negative paradox. They blame this. There is the other option of instead having this relational conjunction and rejecting this for the change. So that's the ambiguity.
That's cute. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I have only a general concern on the strategy, because it's, if I'm not wrong, you kind of use, or at least you are discussing this idea of using rich principles that were originally thought for to capture the
Yeah.
And to be fair, I don't like that, but okay, it's kind of standard, that's it. But then to think that kinds of solve like the correctness problem or the adequacy of problem, it's because you're using, one thing is to say, well, I hold to this logic, and then I think which things this logic kind of back me up to infer, yeah? So, and that's, I think, normative, kind of what it's happening in normativity discussion. But here it's like, now having inferences that don't seem to be okay.
Yes.
It's like, I don't know, the contrapositive, if it's so easy to think in contrapositive terms, it's like changing the rules or something, don't you? I don't know, which were you? I don't know if I'm clear, sorry. And also, it's even using this to capture like paradoxicality. Isn't it too much to us? Because no principle, any principle. No principle will do all that job, I think.
Yeah, I agree. In a sense, Alison Duncan Kerr's attempt was ambitious. If you ask me about this general project of connecting validity of logical principles and normativity stuff, I think I agree with you. This is what I want to have. And
you should look for a different strategy in thinking about the correctness of a logic, if that can be done at all. So yes, I fully agree with that. But I didn't want to say that just as much as I didn't want to pursue this idea that contradictions are the real funny things, because that would be denying too much of the premises of these people, and I wanted to grant as much as possible. So I grant that this project makes sense for the sake of the argument, but then we find this problem for relevance logician, and if they, it is up down to me, but if they want to be involved in this sort of project, then they should have a response to this challenge. And I wanted to say this is a way to respond to the challenge. But if you ask for my general opinion about this, well, this definitely in this doesn't make any sense. Thank you. You get it?
Yes, but you return to the formalization. Then this one. See, I do have a problem with that principle. If this X big phi is supposed to be ranging over not only propositions but also attitudes. The way you use it.
Yeah, no, I was a bit quick.
See, why is there a big X? Is that because you wanted to use also the non-static operator? Am I right?
No, capital X is here for any propositional attitude.
Okay, see, that's what I meant. So
yeah,
you can replace that with I know that I am mistaken about something, right?
In principle, yes.
So that would be a counter example to that condition. Because if I am mistaken into believing something, then I am not mistaken into believing that and knowing that I am mistaken into believing something.
Yes, but I cannot use that because she's not using the I know operator.
No, the belief, the belief.
You know, only with the belief. Yeah.
I am not mistaken into believing something and believing that I am mistakenly believing something. It is not a mistake. It's the only way in which I can believe that I am mistakenly believing something is that I actually mistakenly believe in something.
Yes, I would say that I agree with that, but for the sake of the argument, maybe one should restrict the formation rules for being mistaken and perhaps not allowing for this kind of nested.
But there is a way in the case of mistake, you can paraphrase it as I believe phi and not phi is over there. So not phi and I believe that phi. That's a formalization of the mistake. I believe something that is false. I believe something and that something is false.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe this is a sufficient condition. I don't know. I have to think more about this. Yes, Camilo. I'll just take the coffee break. Any questions? Thank you so much. We are going to have, after